Hi, folks. I see people are starting to come in, and we're just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes, and then we will formally get things started. So just hang tight, and we will get going in a second. We have a lot of folks coming in now. So while we're waiting to get started, I will just let folks know we are going to have a little bit of time for some questions at the end. So if you want to start thinking of your questions, go ahead. There is a Q&A function enabled, so you can ask your questions through there, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can towards the end of the session here.
Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Michael.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Rijin.
Hey, Michael.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Well, Tracy, are you feeling ready to get
Sure.
Okay, let me hit record here.
I think it's recording.
There we go. Oh, yeah, sorry, I meant to download it. All right, Tracy Adler, the director of the Welland Museum. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. We're here with Michael Rakowitz and with Rijin Sahakian to talk more about the fantastic show that we have up at the Welland, which is Michael Rakowitz Nimrod. We've been fortunate enough to extend this show so that it's up until June 18th. Presently, we're only open to the Hamilton community by appointment, but hopefully as things open up, we might be able to have this open to more visitors. But it's been a fantastic show for us. We've enjoyed engaging with so many different disciplines across campus, and it's great to see so many of them who are part of our attendee list here. So I'm just going to introduce Alexander German, our assistant curator of exhibitions and academic outreach, so he can introduce our guests.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Yes, it is my pleasure to welcome our two guests today, Rijin Sahakian and Michael Rakowitz. We'll have a conversation with these two guests for the majority of the hour, and then at the end, we will have time for a few questions. And if you're just joining us, I told everyone you can raise those questions through the Q&A function, and we'll try and get to as many of them towards the end of the hour. Joining us is Rijin Sahakian. She is a writer and arts organizer based in Davis, California. She received her MA in Cultural Policy from NYU and went on to found SADA, a nonprofit project providing arts education, advocacy, and production programs for Baghdad-based artists, which she directed until the spring of 2015. She has contributed writing to a range of artist projects and publications, and has conducted seminars, workshops, and curatorial projects at arts and education spaces in the US and abroad, including Cal Arts, the Rhode Island School of Design, the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, and Mara.10 in Beirut. Her essay, Becoming Known, will appear in the catalog, which is accompanying the exhibition Michael Rakowitz Nimrod at the Welland Museum of Art at Hamilton College. Michael Rakowitz was born in New York, but now lives and works in Chicago, where he is professor of art theory and practice at Northwestern University. He received a bachelor's degree in visual arts from SUNY Purchase in 1995 and a master's degree in visual studies from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1998. His recent one-person museum exhibitions have been organized in Sweden, London, Italy, and Chicago. In 2018, Rakowitz was awarded the commission for a public project on the Fourth Plinth in London's Trafalgar Square, and just last year, Michael won the prestigious Nasher Prize conferred by the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, Texas. And of course, as Tracy just told you, his exhibition, Michael Rakowitz Nimrod, is on view currently at the Welland Museum of Art. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. It's really wonderful to have you offering your perspectives on things here. So I know we're going to talk about a range of issues this evening, but I wanted to get things kicked off with sort of your general thoughts on the art and cultural world of Iraq, because one thing that I have been confronted with in the several months that we've had this exhibition are these misconceptions about the state of art museums and cultural centers in Iraq, about the existence of contemporary art existing there. So on the museum side of things, I know that I can say this is very damaging, this paradigm, because it helps fuel arguments against repatriation of artifacts to Iraqi museums. It also leaves Iraqi artists out of the conversations on current global contemporary art. So Rijin, you have written about your experiences working with Iraqi art students and the feelings that they have about being unheard and unseen, and how this is especially frustrating because these are art students who have lived through different forms of government, who have survived waves of violence in their own lifetime. If anyone has something to say through their art, it's these students, and how we're not really paying attention to the art coming out of places like Baghdad. And Michael, for your part, of course, your installation at the Welland uses the contemporary language of modern Iraq, of the modern Arabic diaspora through the food packaging, but also through the wall labels that contain quotes from modern Iraqis who have lived in and around Nimrud. So I just wanted to start the conversation off tonight by asking you each to sort of share some of your general thoughts on the current state of the Iraqi art world, and or the Iraqi art diaspora. And sorry here. And Rijin, can we start with you?
Sure. And thank you. I think that's a such an important question to lead this discussion. I think there's a number of different issues here. One is Iraq specific, and the other is specific to how the art world functions in general, particularly when we're talking about the contemporary international art world, which really relies on fairly elite forms of higher education and residency programs and ways of being part of a kind of global conversation about art and having your work seen by various curators, gallerists, all of that, and having that kind of network of colleagues, friends, professors, whatever it may be. And that requires, first and foremost, mobility. It requires capital in a certain way to be able to access that kind of level of education. And when I say mobility, I mean also the ability to even leave the country, to circulate in the world in that way. And those are things that are not possible for most young artists that are working in Iraq. I would say that the artists that I worked with who are mainly under 30 and definitely were at the time that I was working with them most intensely, were all, for the most part, either graduates or in the art schools in Baghdad itself, either at the Art Institute or the Baghdad College of Art, which are free to the students who get into the programs. So that is pretty interesting because it doesn't actually require this kind of, it's not an art school that's $30,000, $40,000 a year to go to. It's a free program. But of course, with the impacts of decades of war and people leaving and all of this, it's very difficult to retain the kind of staff and arts and cultural environment that, nurtures any artist, regardless of where they are in the world. But is very much compounded by the circumstances that Iraqi artists are living in, where there really isn't the possibility of, going to multiple galleries or exhibition spaces, which still are there. There are still galleries there and people sharing their work. But it is very much compromised after 2003. Many closures, many people leaving, not as many buyers or collectors, and also a large number of professors and artists leaving the country, right? But you still have generations of students who are attending art school, who are going through the programs, who are doing this work. But these are artists who do not have the sort of, don't have the possibility of circulating very much in the region even. You know, it's not easy necessarily, and hasn't been easy to even go to Lebanon or to go to the UAE or to go to other places that, you know, have a more, I don't know if you'd say established, because Iraq has had an established art scene, but there are people moving through those areas and artists who are able to work professionally and sort of be able to have their work be made more visible. So I would say the things that any artist anywhere in the world relies on, which is a sort of community of people around them and ways to have their work be seen, to expand, to grow as artists, those are so essential. And it's very hard to have that when your daily life is being interrupted in so many of the different ways that that war interrupts life and interrupts ways of working. So what becomes missing from this isn't just that Iraqi artists don't get to show their work or aren't able to easily or more readily be able to have a sustainable career as artists. It also means that the rest of the world doesn't get to see the kind of work and the sort of I say excavations, a sort of mining of their current history and their experiences, that I think would be very valuable for the world to see, because Iraq has shaped our world in really critical and important ways that we are not necessarily just going to get from newspapers or footage of the area, you know, but that you can only really understand and know through the people who are there, and the people sending out this kind of work into the world and into their communities. So this kind of loss, I feel, really is not simply a loss for Iraqi artists, but really is a loss for all of our knowledge. You know, when we talk about, and I think Michael's work hits on this quite a bit, when we talk about the sort of ancient world and ways of knowing something, we really recognize that and value it when we're looking at that period of time. But it is actually this period of time that is going to tell us about the next 100 years and what we're going to go through, that I don't know that we've collectively understood how much what's happened in Iraq is going to set the tone for that, and does set the tone for the world that we are entering into.
It's so important, Rijin, because I think we're better at talking about very apparent physical loss, but that's not the only type of loss that we need to be thinking about in tonight's conversation. Michael, can I turn it to you for some thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to remark on just how wonderful it is to be with Rijin tonight and to be with all of you. Rijin and I have known one another for close to, I'd say, 14 years now, close to 14 years, since we worked together when Rijin was running this incredible Iraq reframe residency at the Montalvo Art Center. And it was through Rijin that I really started to gain some intimacy and some closure of distance with Iraq and Iraqi art. And what I mean by Iraqi art is that it's a kind of intergenerational dialogue that in a way I feel like I was first introduced to the elders of Iraqi art through Nada Shabut, who is a really important contributor to how the canon is being constructed, despite all of the destructive energies that constantly set it back. But then it was through Rijin's work with Sada, and even before that, and now more recently being introduced to younger artists and what their concerns are. And this is one of the reasons why I teach, is that I never ever wanted to not be in a place where I'm having conversations with young artists about their ideas. And so I think that this is something that is not, just conditioned for my interest in what Rijin is doing, but I also think it's so crucial because we have to look also what Rijin is saying, and Rijin is saying it also, in the larger scheme of what it means, to have a sustainable life as an artist. I think that's the word that you used, Rijin. And that's such a rare thing anyway. Like let's be clear that like a sustainable life as an artist is like a rare thing no matter where you are. And I think that one of the things that becomes tragic is when you have different kinds of arts organizations and different kinds of imperatives that will often try to mobilize art as a kind of form of soft power. And this is always something that I think artists, no matter where they are, have to be a little bit aware of. And so, even while we talk about the artists who are missing, from our museum walls and from our consciousness as creative individuals, there's also just a way in which so much of that kind of cultural apparatus that exists post-war, and I hesitate to use that word because as far as I'm concerned the war is ongoing, that there are often these compromises, and so I think that's something that I've always really valued about Sada's mission. And so if I think about the people that Rijin has introduced me to, like the artist Ali Ayal, and an artist that we both know together through different kinds of contexts, Ali Yas, these are very, very different pressures being exerted on their lives that have made a different kind of work, than say previous generations of artists like Rafa Nasiri or Adia Azawi or Hannah Malala, or any of the other artists that people may have seen, through various Iraq exhibitions that have happened over the last years. And the tragic condition is that these works, are still being shown primarily, or these artists are still being shown primarily in the context of Iraqi art, when in fact, their work is in dialogue with a contemporary art, with an emerging vanguard of contemporary art. And I think that that's one thing that I've always admired about Rijin's position, is that there's an unflinching kind of understanding that these are specific conditions, but that difference should not be elevated before the reception of the work. And so that's one of the things that I think is very rare, because too often it does get tokenized or exoticized.
Yes, and I that I want to say that thought about the mobilization of art as a form of soft power, I think we're going to get to in a little bit here, but that I think segues into that's so much of what we're talking about in terms of art of this region. There's a good side and there's a bad side to it, and I specifically want to talk about sort of the museum side of things here, in terms of that. There are several articles that have come out in the past couple years that are seemingly good news about the aid that Western institutions want to offer to Iraqi institutions. And it's a spectrum. It can be individuals training others in terms of conservation or restoration, but it can also be the wholesale just reconstruction of actual physical buildings. And I want to get your thoughts on how these, what are the positives and negatives of these Western-led initiatives to aid Iraqi cultural sites? Are these feel-good stories? Can we talk about them as being a bit of good news, but also making sure that they don't distract us from these larger entrenched issues that exist around repatriation, around museum collecting, around the Western interpretation of Iraqi culture. So Rijin, I'll start with you on that in terms of what do we see as maybe some good news, but does it ever sort of distract us from these larger issues that we still really need to talk about more?
Yeah, I think like there are definitely, American organizations and British organizations that are involved in some of this work. And, on the one hand, there is a responsibility to fund some of that work, right? These are the main, leading powers that were involved in the wars that sort of decimated those sites and areas. And so there is a kind of responsibility for rebuilding and funding restoration efforts in those areas. The feel-good stories, I would also add that there are non-Western countries that are doing the same thing, and not necessarily with better intentions, but that are also funding for their own reasons. Also, it's also feel good stories for them. So I don't know that there's not always a sort of the Western and non-Western funding being sort of cut off that way in terms of one being better than the other, or even the Iraqi government itself funding certain efforts, even though they have, in ways that are detrimental to other, in terms of other efforts that are happening or who they have leading projects. The sort of corruption and problems within the government and within a lot of these campaigns for rebuilding is extremely widespread, and very difficult to untangle. And it really is on a case by case basis how some of this happens. I mean, there are like very small examples, like, every couple of years there's an article in the Post or the Times or something about murals being painted on Baghdad's blast walls, for various occasions. The most recent was the Pope's visit. But before that, it was, a beautification effort. And before that, it was to promote, non-sectarian violence and that kind of thing. And before that, something else, so there is this sort of repetition, similar to articles that you'll see about, preparations for Valentine's Day and people in Baghdad being very excited and sort of looking to this holiday because of how much they've been through. There's always these sort of little ways that they use cultural events or markers, or art in whatever form, whether it's a blast wall or an actual restoration of a site, as a way to signal some kind of progress. I think to me, the question is, how much of that work is being led and done by the people who are experts in that work and care about that work and are responsible to those sites. The people painting the murals, for example, are usually paid by the government to do that for whichever project it is. It's not that there are grants being given to support artists in whatever project they choose or that they're applying for, that kind of thing, and similar to some of these sites, some of them are being done to train and enable people to take control over those areas. And some of them are being conducted in ways that are less than helpful, right? And in terms of rebuilding, so I do think it's very specific to the project itself. And I think the really important thing also is to look at, why is a certain site not flourishing right now, or why was it damaged? Why was it destroyed? What is the community that lives around it? How is it meaningful to them or not meaningful to them? And what is taking place for that community also to be able to live with it again? Whether it's a site or a neighborhood, those walls are walls that represent the blast walls, for example, that murals were painted on, are walls that represented the division of neighborhoods and the bombardment of different neighborhoods and sort of real violence that occurred in different areas and how they were cut off from each other, and a whole other host of things that occurred because of those walls and the extraction it took to build all of this concrete. There's some really interesting work being done, actually, even on the process of all of this concrete being produced in Iraq and the damage that it's doing to the environment and to the country itself. So all of these things are just very, there's just a lot to unpack within them, and they really are so specific to each area and to each campaign. And so I think we always have to take them apart and look at them specifically and see what is being done. You know, most recently, the Mosul Museum has been reopened, and there are different efforts around that. And some of these things remain to be seen, how successful they are. Will it actually reopen for the long term? What will that look like? Who has access to the museum? So beyond the initial opening or the initial restoration are all of the questions that come after it. And so I think it's important to take that long view, because as you know, there are all of these kinds of headlines, but the question is what comes after it and how much of it is ongoing. You know, we don't really often learn very much about the actual long-term effects or productivity of those efforts, right? If they actually did complete the project, many of them haven't been completed, and that's its own issue. And then if they are, have they been able to stay on? You know, some of these projects are all supposed to be taking place, but people who are in charge of them can't actually stay and take on those rebuilding or restoration efforts for a lot of different complicated reasons, because the war keeps going on. And so the conditions are still there that prevent people from doing that long-term work as well. So there's these compounding effects still exist. And this is why rebuilding as a whole, not just in terms of cultural sites, but in terms of the entire country itself, has never been something that has really happened in an effective way. You know, there are still many, many places and sites, from education to healthcare, places and areas that have not been rebuilt because there has not been an end to the violence and corruption and divisiveness, you know, from these wars, that has enabled Iraq to actually get to a point where some kind of rebuilding, as we know it, you know, could actually take place. So that in and of itself is, I think, even the idea of rebuilding, you know, people often ask, you know, how is that going? It must be much better now. The war's been over for a long time. No, it's not better. It's actually much worse. You know, Baghdad is much worse off today than it was immediately after the shock and awe campaign, you know, because at that point it was a somewhat functioning country. You really don't see that very much today. And some, you know, people are surviving, they're living their lives, they have jobs, they're working, they're doing what they do. But the infrastructure and ways that this 30 years of war has has impacted the country continues to compound, and there is no sense of I don't think that it has come to any point that you could say there is a possibility of actually rebuilding in an effective way. Not yet.
So such a important way to echo Michael's initial comment about, you know, the war is not over, and that we fall into a trap of thinking that way. Michael, some thoughts on you know, assistance from other institutions, other countries in terms of the rebuilding effort of Iraqi sites?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I find myself thinking about in all of this is just when we have those initiatives that do come from the outside, and you do have different museums that are contracting with places like the Mosul Museum, for instance, which is contracting with the Smithsonian and with the Louvre. And those kinds of initiatives, you know, are certainly well intentioned, and I would prefer for someone like the director of the Mosul Museum to speak, you know, to how that is. But I do wonder what that means, like when imperial museums are healing these sites. You know, what does that mean about restitution efforts? You know, what's the fallout from that kind of support to create conditions where we're not going to just be thinking about rebuilding what was destroyed by you know, wars by places like France, that places like France and the US have been involved in, and also the colonial project that the French were involved in. But you know, what does that mean think beyond that, like beyond the exhibition space being renewed and the building being repaired. You know, when we talk about restoration in museums, I think about how that can extend to almost replace this word repatriation, which has the word, you know, the word for country, patrie, in it. And I'd like to think beyond nation states and to think about what, you know, a restorative project looks like, not just about the restoration of the object, but something that's about a kind of restorative justice. And so when I think about these museums and what's been looted and destroyed inside of them, I'm not willing to look at it only in the frame of the way it gets broadcast through ISIS's videos, but to understand that ISIS's videos destroying monumental artifacts, the smaller ones they actually sold in the black market to fund their war machine. But when they're destroying colossal pieces like the Lamassu or the reliefs in the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, they understand that they're destroying something that's been valued by the global North and the West. And so those kinds of things for me are part of what I want to know, you know, when we're talking about the rebuilding of these things and whether or not they're feel-good stories or a form of identity correction, you know, by these international museums. I think it's, you know, it's interesting, you know, because I do think that like there's a lot of places to go with this, and no place feels quite right. You know, that I'm not willing to completely damn it, but I'm also not completely willing to valorize it. Um, I do wonder what the intentions are. I did a project in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, for Documenta in 2012, and it was dealing with the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were destroyed by the Taliban in March of 2001. And as part of the work, I actually included a quote from Mullah Muhammad Omar, who actually explains that he had dissuaded the Taliban, you know, from destroying the Buddhas of Bamiyan 2 or 3 times before, and that it was only after a European country came to them and said, "We have $30 million we want to give you to repair one of the Buddhas that's been damaged by rains." And they said, "Well, can we use this money, you know, for the people of Afghanistan, the children who are dying from famine, you know, from hunger?" And the European country said, "No, this is for the Buddhas." And he became enraged that this money for objects was not able to be diverted to help the people. Now we can talk about, you know, and that's why he decided to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas, and he thought it was just so callous and awful. And we can talk about how that might be a disingenuous quote, but it certainly puts it out there, about like what is the, you know, what is being restored and what is being preserved in Iraq and what isn't. You know, like Rijin's talking about these sites, you know, these neighborhoods that are in ruins that have concrete walls as a kind of safety, and certain sites are being deemed, you know, worth saving, and others are just being allowed to continue to kind of plummet. And so, you know, those things are, I mean, those are things that I'm trying to look more closely at, and to kind of also just get the words ancient and antiquity out of my system, you know, because it allows for the world to separate the Iraqis from those pieces of culture that come from earlier, you know, earlier generations, and to see the kind of continuance of those people would be to really kind of recognize the fact that everything kind of needs to be restored. You know, we're not just talking about the museum, because the museum is a photo op. You know, the director of the museum can receive the ambassador and make it seem like everything is normal, you know, when the electricity is only on for 3 hours during the day, and they take the photo during that 3-hour window. You know, so those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to be mindful of.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we look at sort of the aid that is going into cultural sites and everything, what both of you are reminding me of is thinking about, well, what is that aid for? And you know, sort of echoing, I know, Michael, you've said several times during our programming, you know, this notion of museums are focused on objects, and so then when they go out to help other institutions, you know, they're still thinking about objects and how do we start incorporating more care for the people. You know, that museums are good at caring about objects, but we have a lot of work to do in terms of actually caring the same amount about the people who for whom these objects are important, for the people that made these objects. And it makes me think of something that you illuminated for me, which I thought was so special in terms of, you know, your practice in Chicago involves you having these relationships with shopkeepers there, and that you have found that some of these store owners are Syrian Christians, and so in effect you are buying the goods to recreate these objects that are now destroyed but were created with the bare hands of their ancestors, and so you see that sort of continuation happening in your work, which I think is so beautiful. But it also makes me want to dig into this next question, which is just sort of the different ways that I think, Michael, I'm hoping you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but that there can be simultaneous multiple interpretations of your work, and how both of those things can sit side by side with each other. And specifically what I'm talking about, you know, my experience bringing in students and faculty to this exhibition for the better part of our academic year now, I think people do understand that this set of objects that you have created are reappearances. They're not recreations. They're not replacements for a set of lost objects, but they are an archival marker of that loss, and people understand them as a form of protest. And protest a lot of times in our minds is seen, you know, as something associated with antagonism. But you have so beautifully spoken about one of the function of protests is actually to help people remember they're not alone, and it's to provide solidarity for the people in that protest. So along those lines, you know, I also noticed that some students see these cut up collaged pieces of paper originally from the Arabic world, and kind of see it as almost a moment of healing for this very fractured diaspora of people, and sort of the way you've kind of brought them back together in this mosaic. You know, and then at the same time, there are students who are overwhelmed by the emptiness of the room that you've created at the Welland, half of which has reappeared panels, and then you know, the other half of the room is just completely empty, and so they feel that loss. So there's, you know, for different students, there's sort of almost a healing moment, and for some students, they're really feeling sort of the power of that protest against the series of removals that happened at Nimrud. So can you kind of you know, Rijin, from your sort of art critic, art history maybe angle, and then Michael, you know, obviously as the artist, can you talk a little bit about where you see the work falling, and maybe if, you know, if one interpretation is more important for different moments or different groups of people, because it's just been so fascinating to me that I can take people into one artwork and have totally different experiences with them on a class by class basis.
Yeah, I think that's really the beauty in the work, and in a lot of Michael's practice, I think, is this recognition of there not being a resolution, or a resolution that's not tidy, or one that is sort of haunted, always haunted, right? Because I think the thing that we keep talking about is the fact that there is this ongoing sort of pain that comes with the history of Iraq, and when we're looking at it and we're talking about people who remain, people who have left, objects that remain, objects that have left for various reasons, whether it's, you know, Michael's project where he traced dates being exported, you know, from Iraq to New York, you know, I think that also was something that you could see as this something that a project that was very healing, you know, doing something that's reopening, you know, your grandfather's shop and your like reaching back into your family history, that can be seen as really healing and really empowering, and something where you're sort of recreating that kind of history, and tracing something that's happening in the present day that is so important, and doing it through this really, really critical fruit, you know, and I think that could be seen also as something that is healing, but was also a project that was really centered on loss, and the dates were damaged, and there was a lot of trauma that occurred with the dates during their journey, and you know, all of that was part of the project. And I think so again, you have this, you know, these different layers of something being, you know, something reappearing, you know, this sort of export, you know, this business, you know, and this sort of and this fruit from a place that has this kind of, has gone through this kind of experience, and you also have the reality of what happened during that journey and what happens when it comes here, and the fact that, you know, it comes here and then what, you know, and what happens to the conditions that surrounded why it had to close in the first place all of those years ago, and what it means for what happened to that fruit while it was on its way. You know, all of those things are really difficult and painful things to acknowledge. So I think in a lot of their work, there is this duality that's really important, because you can't actually talk about these kinds of events and these sorts of like really torn apart histories without the beautiful, the amazing things that come from it, and really important, not just memories, but current experiences that come from it. You know, living in Iraq isn't just a series of horrific events, right? There's also a lot of beauty and pleasure and truth that comes from being in that place. And then there's also all the rest that comes with being at the site of, you know, almost continuous warfare, and the only site really that's been held the brunt of a global coalition of wars for this long of a period. So I think what people experience most likely when they're having these two different experiences in the exhibition is actually really important in understanding the work, right? That there is something that will never be resolved in that work. And when you are reappearing something, it's being reappeared because there's something that extracted it in the first place, right? So you can never really have it reappear without, you know, holding also that extraction and what surrounds it.
Thank you, Rijin. And again, a reminder, Rijin wrote a wonderful essay called Becoming Known about Michael's work and this exhibition. So that'll be in the catalog, which will be coming out later this year. And I can't wait for everyone else to read that. Michael, some thoughts on the duality of interpretations and how you view that as the maker of the work?
Well, I want to be careful because I feel strongly about not over determining or overburdening the way that my work can be seen, like just listening to Rijin's amazing thoughts for the last couple of minutes. There's a lot of things that emerged, where she was teaching me about my work, and telling me what she saw, and I'm so appreciative for that. I think for me, it is important to produce things that are kind of like these unresolvable moments, for the viewer, and also creating unresolvable moments of agreement, for the institution, for instance, and trying to create those moments of unresolved, those moments that are unresolved is the way for the work to continue to be made. That the work is never truly finished. Like so many of my works fall under this rubric, like when I'm putting down dates, that it says ongoing. And it's because, you know, the conditions in our world will exert different pressures on those things, you know, like the date syrup and the dates, and that story will continue to evolve, and that work will continue to be sculpted. And so for me, it's almost as if like you know, there's no entropy really in my work. I just think it continues to be made, you know. And so that for me is important, and I appreciate the use of that term, you know, of what is unresolved. I mean, I feel strongly about, you know, the culinary kind of conditions of my work as well, that when I think about the projects where I've gone even further than just like the packaging, but like opened up the food and have made it for people in projects like Enemy Kitchen, Iraqi cooking, and I feel like I've spoken about this a lot. So for anyone who's hearing me say this again, I'm sorry, but Iraqi cooking is sort of based on hamud helu, you know, sweet and sour. You know, so like if you're making kabba, which is kind of like the Iraqi dumpling, you make your dumpling, you know, with a relatively sweet and aromatic spice mixture. You want to make sure that the stew that you're cooking it in is sour, and vice versa. And that's because you want flavors held in a space of tension. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm always trying to do with my work, is to like provide a flavor rather than an answer, you know, and to open up more questions than answers. And the other thing I'll say is that, like, as I talk about reappearance, I think about, you know, the way that these reappearances, uh, these ghosts or these effigies of what was there and what's now not there. I mean, these are all things that have disappeared, and I've reappeared them, and those reappearances will disappear again. And that's what a good ghost does. They reappear, but then they disappear. You can't haunt unless there's a threat that you're going to be gone again. And I also think about what it means to see double. And when you're seeing double, it's usually after you've been hit really hard, you know, and that you're not quite well. And my hope is that the work, you know, can do that too, is, you know, to put the viewer a little bit on the back foot. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
And I want to echo, you know, that, Michael, because I think that, you know, we've had a lot of class visits and you've heard a lot of different interpretations from students, but you've always taken all of those interpretations, you know, very thoughtfully in and responded to them. And I think that's what's so great about you as an artist, is you don't want to over determine, you know, what the work is too much. For folks, if you're paying attention to the chat, I did put in there a link to a wonderful cookbook that you should all look at, and that is Michael's book, A House with a Date Palm Will Never Starve. I think it's 41 chefs, is that right, Michael, who offer you some recipes. So if you want to start dipping your toes into Iraqi cuisine, I think that is a wonderful place to start. And then just to follow up, Rijin was talking about an artwork that Michael did, and I believe, Michael, it's called Return, or The Return. Return, in which you were trying to import the dates to the US. So that's a fascinating one to look up, and that's on Michael's website. We are rapidly approaching the end of the hour, so I do want to dig into a couple questions here, and a couple of them are actually about contemporary art. So I'm going to kind of bundle that a little bit. And so I guess what I'm going to ask is, where do you see contemporary art being shown in Iraq? You know, is it the museums? Is it more community art centers? Is it, artist run spaces? Are people doing it out of their living rooms? Where do you see contemporary art being shown in Iraq? And we have some people who are very interested in any of your recommendations. Are there any Iraqi artists that we should be looking at that maybe we're not right now? So Rijin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say that in Iraq and things, I'm not the sole authority on this, of course, but when I was there, I saw the best work in people's sort of home studios. So I had gone to I was, spending time at the College of Art, meeting different artists, and I was able to, I met a number of different people, and, was invited into people's homes. And, one day in particular, we walked through the sort of maze of apartments and got to a studio where 3 painters were working together. And it was really some of the most stunning painting I'd seen. And they had just sort of gotten their, funds together, and were sharing this apartment and just using it basically as their studio. They slept there and painted there and went to art school during the day. People do, all over. But what they were painting was really interesting because they were using themselves as props and sort of acting out different experiences they had had, but also how they felt about them. And they were just very, very intense and really different sorts of images and styles that I hadn't seen sort of together in that kind of way and with that kind of intensity, especially at the age that they were, they were 19, 20. So what is interesting is that the art schools there are not necessarily teaching contemporary art. They're sort of still teaching painting and sculpture. And a lot of the art history is sort of still in that era, the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, the sort of modernist period in Iraq. And some the 80s and 90s, but there isn't much in the way of contemporary art. A lot of that language isn't in Arabic necessarily, and there aren't, necessarily professors that are left that are teaching that kind of work. So what was interesting about that is that some of the students had sort of taken it on themselves to kind of use what was happening in the present day and have this kind of relationship with painting or video or street art, graffiti and photography, in a way where they were developing their own language around what we call contemporary art, what that might be, even if they weren't being sort of formally instructed in it or having any formal critique in it. And I say that not to romanticize the work that's being done there. It's not that everything is, this amazing new invented language, but I say it in that what I saw was this really interesting way that artists were working together and linking up with each other to sort of figure out how to make things work. So if an artist wanted to do like, for example, a young artist named Leila Al-Husseini, who works in photography and also some video, decided to do this project, a really ambitious project actually, where he, in Iraq, there have been, particularly in Baghdad, there was a period where car bombings were happening very, very, very often. And it was very scary to go out because there's a lot of traffic, and you would never know necessarily if a car bomb was going to happen, when it would occur, if you might be stuck in traffic and it could happen to you one day. When you were driving, the first thing people do is check under their seats for some sort of explosive. So it's a very charged kind of atmosphere. And if you imagine growing up as a teenager in that kind of atmosphere, and there's no way to sort of process that kind of fear, like there hasn't really been, sort of moments where Iraqis can take a breath and sort of understand what all of that means to go through. So Leila decided to do this video, and he invited his neighbors, friends, other artists to help him with it, where he went to a junkyard where they put a lot of these they're like old Jeeps that have been used quite often as car bomb, like to blow up. And so he had different people, from kids to his grandmother, to neighbors, to friends, sit in the car, and he would videotape them and ask them questions about what it feels like to be in the car, what they think about they would do if something hit, what position would they be in to protect themselves. All of these questions and ways of processing something that he made the space for that to happen, and filmed this place that, again, is a site you don't really normally think of, or would never even imagine wouldn't think exists necessarily, right? But is a part of the landscape there, and is a part of what people do think about quite often. And so he created this space for that to happen. And he did it with a lot of cooperation. It's not that he was getting, a $10,000 grant to do this film, but there's a community behind him that helped him make the film, that he could tap into to work on it, and that he screened, with others. So I think there's these kinds of projects that are really difficult to know about. I mean, to be totally honest, I think it is very hard to sort of know what artists are doing. And being outside of Iraq, at this point, I haven't been back in a number of years, and I don't necessarily know anymore what many different artists are doing. I know what a few are that I've been in touch with, but it's very difficult to know without being there. So I will say that I think people are working in very experimental ways and collaborative ways, and that a lot of that work is public. But I don't know that there's any sort of central place necessarily to start to know that work, or to really get a large sense of, there's no central contemporary Iraqi art museum where you might, it's not the same as in, even Amman or Beirut or other areas where you might have more central organizations to go to find out more.
And so is that after you get out of art school, is there that support network for artists? We had another question come in, like, what you've been talking about art school, what happens after art school?
I think it's really difficult. There isn't necessarily a lot of support, there are many I think there are artists who try, but there is not necessarily funding in Iraq for artists after, art school is free, but after that, you're sort of on your own in a way, unless you can sell work. But most people are buying more traditional works. There isn't a sort of necessarily a scene for contemporary art there. And again, there isn't a lot of traveling being done by artists, for a lot of reasons, structural reasons. But I will say there are artists who are still creating work and still producing work, but it's not, I don't think they are always necessarily showing it, or very, very rarely showing it outside of Iraq, or even there are not necessarily established sites inside Iraq, but there are some collectives that are in the city still, where artists are working together. And in the large protest movements that happened last year, where they're still happening, but last year was this huge outpouring in Iraq. People saw a lot of, creative work, murals and that kind of thing. I would say that that's different, but it showed in that kind of grassroots organizing, which was primarily youth-led, showed the kind of organizing and resourcefulness and creativity that a lot of these younger people have, because they haven't necessarily had any kind of top-down support or infrastructural support for their work. For their work to sort of be seen or to be realized in a more institutional sort of setting.
Which definitely gets back to what you were talking about in terms of the infrastructure just not being there.
Yeah, I would just add that, it takes a lot to get a grant, like an international grant or something like that, or to be shown somewhere else, from your artist statement, which is a really particular kind of language, to your resume and your CV and all of the different grants that occur. And those can be really hard, even for people who are very, Americans or Europeans, to complete and to be competitive for. and it just becomes that much harder if you're not versed in that language. And if English is not a language you're proficient in, most of them don't accept applications in Arabic. And so there's a lot of ways that artists get cut off from that kind of funding. And I think Iraq is double, there's this other level of hardship, which is that a lot of grantors, if they are, there are some European foundations that give grants to places in Iraq, for example, but they want a sponsoring organization. So, and that gets really tricky because to have an organization in Iraq, it's hard because there's a great deal of corruption in Iraq. And so having an organization that is associated with the government or with a kind of institution can get very tricky and is not necessarily something someone would want to be a part of or want to organize with. So there's this kind of layering of obstacles that you can tend to get. So I would say it's difficult, but I do think that the artists there are, and the people there in general, especially younger generations, are incredibly resourceful. And I think it will change. I think it already is changing. And so the more that people are able to sort of organize on their own, the more that I think we might be starting to see more work emerge potentially.
I know we are already a couple minutes over the hour, but I can't let us go without Michael lending his thoughts to that topic as well. Michael, are there places, more people we should be looking at, more places we should be looking at in terms of contemporary Iraqi art in your mind?
Yeah, I do. One of the things that that I wanted to bring up is, this fraught word diaspora, but when I think about the Iraq that's outside of Iraq and Iraqis that are outside of Iraq, I've come to know some wonderful artists here in the United States. People like somebody who's in the audience today, Yarub Al-Obaidi, who I had the chance to collaborate with in Philadelphia when I was doing a project there called Radio Silence. And he's doing amazing work at every different level, working at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Penn Museum, and making sure that that he's able to kind of connect earlier Iraqis with present day Americans, and also not necessarily ventriloquize those objects, but allow for them to speak for themselves. And he's doing that in a beautiful way. But he has all these whole myriad of projects that include everything from storytelling. He's actually produced the first Arabic language newspaper in Philadelphia ever, by working with groups, and just amazing work. I mean, I can't say enough about Yarub. There's not enough good things that can be said about him, but also the community that that I was able to access in that space, that one place, Philadelphia. We recently lost this amazing poet, Leila Al-Husseini, who was part of that same community. So I would say that, there's many people to be looking at, and but I just wanted to kind of mention that something that Rijin said is very much alive in people like Yarub, which, and you mentioned it, Rijin, which is the collaborative kind of aspect of it, and the kind of collective quality to it, which is something that I think moves against, the way that we have siloed art into a kind of a boutique kind of sensibility. This idea that it's done alone by some, some exceptional genius, and to recognize that we're all always thinking with each other. We're all always working with each other. And I adore the communities of Iraqis that I've been welcomed in by, taken in by, whether it's Philadelphia or Malmo, or Chicago. And the one thing that I can say that's a common thread throughout is that you're always part of something bigger,
Mm.
and you're always part of something that began long before you got there, and you're going to help continue long after you're gone. And so that's one of the things that I can say. But I also just want to say that Rijin has actually introduced me to some of the most interesting art that I've seen in a long time by showing me the work of artists like Ali Al. And when she was telling me the first stories about Ali's work, it wasn't about his work. It was like, yeah, I was just on the phone with him and he was cooking, for the protesters at the front lines during the October Revolution last year. And that tells you everything you need to know about an art scene, which is very different than what you might expect from an art scene in a place like New York.
That is, I can't think of a more beautiful way to sort of wrap things up than those sentiments, Michael. I want to make sure that we get this this shout out though properly done. So for everyone still with us, that is Yaroub Obadi, and that's Yaroub, last name Obaidi. Go check out that artist's work. I want to remind folks, if you're faculty, staff, or students on the Hamilton campus, we want you to come into the museum and see this amazing installation by Michael Rakowitz, which is the reappearance of Room H from the site of Nimrud. But if you're not on our campus, that's okay too. We want you to go to our website. If you go to the exhibition page for Michael's show, we have a 360 tour. We have some installation views. And we have a lot of great resources, including a fantastic video that the Welland created, which is a new interview with Michael. You can also find that on the Welland's YouTube page. Rijin Sahakian, Michael Rakowitz, thank you so much for your time, for your amazing thoughts, and for continuing to collaborate with the Welland. And Michael, we'll keep seeing you very soon over the course of this semester. So thank you both. Thank you for everyone coming tonight and giving us your time and your great questions. And we hope everyone has a great week.